Hi, welcome to Church For Skeptics, and Merry Christmas. Kind of funny, every Christmas I sit in my house after all the festivities are done, and I think, you know, before you turn around good, it's going to be Christmas again. And sure enough, I did last year, and sure enough, it's about Christmas again. So we want to talk about Christmas tonight, and I'm calling this a night of miracles, so you can guess which direction I'm going to go in here. But I thought I would just start by reading a bit of the Christmas story that we usually read. I want to read from Luke. Matthew records some. Luke records the most about Christmas, and I think it's because, as Luke says, he researched his gospel. And so I think he talked more personally to Mary. But let's read a little bit from chapter 2 of Luke. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Well, we could go a lot of directions here, but I want to look at Christmas from a couple of perspectives. And because this is Church for Skeptics, let's look at it from a scientific perspective first, because obviously most people think miracles are impossible. And even though he doesn't really mention the virgin birth here, that's the whole point of Christmas, and we can talk about the theological necessity of that. But scientifically, many people would say miracles are impossible. And I want to say, why? How can science show that miracles are impossible any more than science can show that God doesn't exist, which it absolutely cannot. Richard Dawkins says that way back in the 18th century, David Hume, the philosopher, had the last word on miracles. Well, if that's the case, then maybe we should listen to what David Hume has to say and see how solid his argument is. I can give it to you in a couple of ways, but I'm going to give it to you in a simple way. I'll do both ways. First, he says, number one, miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. Point number two would be that the laws of nature are never violated. He says it in a little different way. He says it is the uniform experience of humanity that miracles never occur, that the laws of nature are never violated. So, therefore, miracles do not happen. Well, you know, Richard Dawkins notwithstanding, that is a completely circular argument. It's a logical fallacy called begging the question. And the weak point in his argument really is that how does he know that the so-called laws of nature are never violated? How can he possibly know that? He assumes it to be true, but he has no real evidence that that's so. It's also called arguing in a circle, as I said. Let me read you. I know it's not great to read to you, but I just think this is so good. I'm going to read you a brief part from one of the greatest minds, a contemporary of C.S. Lewis. As a matter of fact, C.S. Lewis's hero, kind of. A guy named G.K. Chesterton, who was an atheist, who said he became a believer by reading The Atheist. But I want you to listen to this, and I think it's just fantastic. So G.K. Chesterton says this. He says, "But my belief that miracles have happened in human history is not a mystical belief at all. I believe in them upon human evidence, as I do in the discovery of America. Somehow or another, an extraordinary idea has arisen that the disbelievers in miracles accept them only in connection with some dogma, in Coley and Fairley, I'm sorry, let me start that sentence over. Somehow or other, an extraordinary idea has arisen that the disbelievers in miracles consider them coldly and fairly, while believers in miracles, i.e. me, accept them only in connection with some dogma. Let me translate that for you. So what Chesterton's saying is that most people perceive that people who don't believe in miracles are analyzing the facts and the data very coldly and fairly, but that people like me who believe in miracles just believe in them because we believe in miracles. It's associated with some doctrine or dogma that we hold. And he says the fact is quite the other way. The believers in miracles, me, accept them rightly or wrongly because they have evidence for them. The disbelievers in miracles deny them, rightly or wrongly, because they have a doctrine against them. I think that is exactly so. Okay, so again, put another way, what they're saying is that they're claiming, these skeptics are claiming that there is a uniformity of experience that miracles don't happen. 2013, the New York Times had an article by a guy named Adam Gopnik. Let me read you one of his sentences. He says, we know, think about this, what he's saying. What an unbelievably arrogant statement. We know that in the billions of years of the universe's existence, there is no evidence of a single miraculous intercession with the laws of nature. Well, that's simply not true. Number one, he doesn't know that, and number two, the uniform experience of a great number of humanity is that miracles do happen. Let me just show you this. I just want to show you, I've got two books here by two scholars. One is Craig Keener, considered one of the great New Testament scholars. This guy's an egghead. This is the smallest, shortest book he's written, and it's only volume 1. This is a book on miracles by Eric Metaxas, and both of them chronicle modern-day miracles from doctors and missionaries and the people that have had the miracles happen to them from all over the world. To say that there's a uniform experience against them is just wrong. Now, let me soften the blow just a little bit. Both Hume and Dawkins and Gopnik, the guy that wrote the article, talk about the laws of nature, and so it seems rather, I don't know, harsh or tough to say that miracles violate the laws of nature. Maybe it would help us if we thought about it just a different way. And of course, all this is going towards the idea of the virgin birth, which we'll explain from a different vantage point when we leave the scientific viewpoint here. What are the laws of nature anyway? Are they prescriptive? That is to say, does a rock decide I need to obey the law of gravity? Is it really a law of gravity, or is it just a description of what always happens naturally? To me, that's really all it is. That's all we can say. And I think Albert Einstein actually said the same thing, that the laws of nature aren't really laws. They're descriptions of what normally happens, unless there's some kind of divine intervention. So really a miracle is not a violation of the law of nature. It's not disobeying any kind of a law that it should be subject to. God's certainly not disobeying a law that he should be subject to. Think of it as an interruption of the description of nature. If you want to call it the law of gravity, it's an interruption of the law of gravity. Ever since humanity existed, babies came into the world through sexual relations between a man and a woman, human babies that is, and the virgin birth is simply an interruption of the normal process. So I think that's, when you say it that way, it just simply softens the blow, and at least it makes it more reasonable to consider. So here again, I've got two huge books, and there are a lot more that testify that there are millions and millions of people who have experienced and claim to experience miracles. I guess personally I'd be somewhat hard-pressed to give you a definite, no doubt about it, miracle in my life, although I think some have happened. But let me make this point. I think not Hume necessarily, because he was before modern science and certainly before the Big Bang Theory, but Richard Dawkins and Mr. Gopnik that wrote the article would agree that the universe popped into existence, 14.5 I think is the current number of years, 14.5 billion years ago out of nothing. If that's not a miracle, it's mighty curious, because the laws of nature weren't around to make that happen. So the universe itself is a product of a, if you want to call it, a violation of the laws of nature. I hope you understand the point that I want to make here. Basically, it's that the universe, science is kind of, I don't want to say it's backed itself into a corner, because science is great. It's a gift of God, and we do science because God has gifted us with the ability to reason and look at evidence. So we're not anti-science in the least, but let me just say atheistic science has kind of backed itself into a corner with the whole Big Bang idea. The fact that the universe had an absolute beginning out of nothing, or what they call a singularity, is basically the same thing. Here's why. The universe can't cause itself to come into existence. That's absurd. It would have to exist before it existed, and that's an impossibility logically. So I hope you get this, and I want to move on, but I need to make this point. You've only got two choices here, and one is another impossibility. Either the universe came into existence out of nothing, or it is the result of an infinite regression of causes and effects, and the universe is just the latest effect, let's say, not latest, but 14 billion years ago. But what I want you to understand is it's impossible to have an infinite regression of causes and events. You'd never have a starting point, and you would have never gotten to the universe. St. Augustine said it this way: if time did not have an absolute beginning, we would have never gotten to this moment, because you'd never have a starting point. One of my students put it this way: you can start a race that you never finish, but you can't finish a race you never start. Try counting to 10 starting nowhere. It just doesn't work. Well, the only alternative to that is that whatever caused the universe to come into existence must be eternal. It can't, in other words, and if it's eternal, it doesn't have a cause for itself. Well, that's very close to God, the description of God. As a matter of fact, it is the description of God. So it's very reasonable. It's not in the least unreasonable to believe that God spoke the universe into existence. Now, let's switch over to the subject of miracles then. If God can speak the universe into existence from nothing, then is it any kind of a rational stretch to say that God can speak into the universe which he created? Hey, that's a miracle. When God speaks into the universe which he created, that's simply an interruption of the normal activities of nature. That's a miracle. So I don't see that it's a stretch at all. Even Albert Einstein, who was not a Christian at all, I don't think he even believed in a personal God necessarily, but he did say this. He said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." He also said this. He said, you can, and this is a wonderful statement, he said, "You can speak of the ethical foundations of science." In other words, why should we do science? Why does right and wrong, the idea of good behavior, lead us to do science? You can speak of that. But he said you can't speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. And that's exactly, of course, what people want to do today. They want to call morality some sort of evolutionary instinct in our brain, but Albert Einstein would have vehemently disagreed. And the translation of what he said is, there's another world. And that's really what I want to talk about, that there is another world. And Christmas is the other world breaking into, speaking into this world. So let me sum up what we've tried to convey so far. What I want to say is that to say that it's impossible for miracles to occur is not a scientific statement. Science has limits. It can describe the laws of nature, if you want to call them that. It can describe what usually happens or what always naturally happens, we'll put it that way. But it's not a scientific statement any more than it is to say that the only way we can know anything is through science. That's a statement of faith. That's a dogma. That's the doctrine that G.K. Chesterton was talking about that causes people to not believe in any miracles no matter what the evidence is. But at the very least, we have to know by reason alone that something exists outside of the universe, or the universe would not be here, or someone outside of the universe. So really, the truth is, if you want to prove that miracles can't happen, you're pretty much stuck with proving that God doesn't exist, and that certainly hasn't been done. So deism, one more point I want to make, and then we'll move on. Thomas Jefferson said it this way. He was a deist, which means that he believed God created the universe, but that he made such a perfect universe, governed by the laws of nature, that he could not speak into it. In other words, once he set the machine in motion, the Newtonian machine they call the universe, and once he sets that in motion, he can't speak into it. Well, that's just silly. Number one, why would he want to make a universe and then walk away from it? That doesn't sound very godlike. And number two, it's really, here's an analogy, it's like saying, oh, I believe that Tolstoy could write War and Peace, but once he's written it, I don't believe he could ever go in and move a comma or extend a sentence or move a period or start another paragraph. Anything, here's what I want to say. Anything other than creating the universe is a lesser miracle than creating the universe. And we know the universe came into existence out of nothing, so something outside of it had to cause it. I think it's God, and if God can speak into the universe, it's always a lesser miracle than speaking the universe itself into existence. So another subject or topic we need to talk about is another skeptical view. I think there's a perception that ancient people in the ancient world, people who would have lived in the first century when Jesus was born, were just so ignorant of the laws of nature, and I keep using that word, that they would believe anything, that they weren't skeptical at all, and so we're much more educated today, and so we're not going to believe anything that we can't know for certain or that we can't find evidence for. There's plenty of evidence out there, but we sort of set our minds against that because it sounds so uneducated. Well, I want to debunk that right off the bat. People in the first century were no dumber than we are today. As a matter of fact, I think they were smarter. At least they were smart enough to believe in a preponderance of evidence and reason that nature is not all there is, the remote possibility of a miracle at least, but they knew, they couldn't describe to you DNA or the biological processes by which babies are born, but think about it. What was Mary's response when the angel Gabriel came and told her, you are blessed among women, you're going to have a child and you're going to call his name Jesus because he will save his people from his sins? Her response was not okie dokie. Her response was complete skepticism. She said, how can this be, seeing I have not had sexual relations with a man? If you're a King James guy, it would be, I have not known a man. So Mary knew as a teenage girl in the first century exactly where babies came from. Joseph had the same response. It's interesting to me that Matthew just records Joseph's response. Matthew doesn't, maybe didn't know about the visit from Gabriel to Mary. I think he probably did, but he chose to just record Joseph's response. When Mary became pregnant as Joseph's fiancée, Joseph knew what always happened. He knew and assumed that Mary must have had sexual relations with a man. Maybe it was the rape of a Roman soldier. But he was of a mind to put her away or divorce her privately so that she wouldn't be stoned, which was what the Jewish law would have demanded. But it took another visit from an angel to convince Joseph that this was indeed a miraculous birth. And so he accepted his role. Mary accepted her role, and I think this is important to say. You put yourself in Mary's place. She's a teenage Jewish virgin, wrapped up in her family and with her reputation, and she pretty much gave that up. She was the first person, I think, to accept Jesus on his own terms, and it cost her a lot. I think she gets a lot of credit for that. So we've said that you can't say miracles are impossible. Actually, there's much evidence from all over the world that they've happened, despite what Hume says, despite what Dawkins says, and their rejection of any evidence for any miracle is part of their dogma, part of their statement of faith. Second thing we've said is that people in the first century were skeptical just like we are today. So it took some convincing, it took some evidence is what we're saying here. I think that's important for them to believe in miracles too. Even the resurrection of Jesus. The disciples didn't believe it because they knew dead people don't rise again, don't live again physically. Now, a lot of skeptics want to make Jesus just another myth. They want to say, well, look, every culture in history, from Egypt to Greece to Rome to Persia, they've all had these myths about dying and rising saviors and virgin births, and Jesus is just another in the long line of those myths. Well, I want to address that in the rest of the program in a little different way than you might expect. So stay with us as we conclude. I've done several programs in the past refuting the idea of what's called the Zeitgeist movie, that Jesus is just another myth in a long line. And the truth is, there were no virgin births. There were births that were miraculous, but they all involved sex with some god and some woman. And there were no physical resurrections, so they're really stretching the point to try to make Jesus perfectly in line. Although I want to be a little more sympathetic to those myths. C.S. Lewis was one of the great minds of the 20th century. He lost his mother when he was 8 or 9 years old, and then he went to World War I and saw the horrors of that war with the trench warfare and the gas warfare, and he came out of it a complete atheist. And he believed that this world was all there was, well, all there is, and he thought it was a sorry mess, that had no meaning. He was not only an atheist, but a nihilist. At the same time, it saddened him. And what he wondered was, why do I rebel against it? If there's no meaning at all, why do I not like that? Well, he said it this way. He said, if there's no meaning in the universe, we should have never found out that there's no meaning. In the same way that if the whole universe were dark and there were no creatures with eyes, darkness would be without meaning. If there's no light, everything's dark, no eyes, darkness and light would have no meaning at all. So if the universe is just it's just an accidental mess with no meaning at all, we're part of it. Why should we rebel? How should we have found out that it has no meaning? Number one, that's a problem because that revelation itself has meaning. But C.S. Lewis had something else. He had a love for the ancient myths. He was a literature teacher at Oxford University in England, and one of his best friends, oddly enough in some ways, was J.R.R. Tolkien. And surely you know that name if you've never seen or read Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien is the author of those wonderful stories and of course the movies that were made from those stories. And they were friends. And they both loved the ancient mythology, the Norse mythology. And C.S. Lewis thought they were beautiful stories, but it made him sad because he wanted the world to be like that. He wanted there to be, in other words, real love and real courage and real virtue that were represented in all of those ancient myths. Well, J.R.R. Tolkien was a great friend of his, and they spent a lot of time talking. Tolkien was a Christian. He was a believer. So what he wanted to convince Lewis of is that the myths, the idea of another world existing where love is real, it's not just an accidental conglomeration of atoms. Love is real, courage is real, heroism is real, virtue is real, justice is real, and none of those things have any meaning in a naturalistic world. So what Tolkien believed, rightly so, is that the myths of all the ages are true. Now, he doesn't think that they're true in that Zeus really existed, or that Thor really existed, or that the Viking gods really existed. But what he believed was true about the myths were the really important things about the universe, about our experience, that there is another world where love and virtue and justice and those kinds of things that are so important to us but are meaningless unless that other world exists. And what Tolkien convinced or wanted to convince Lewis of is that one time the other world came into this world in the person of Jesus Christ. In other words, one time the myth is really true in both ways, both in meaning and in history. And that set Lewis off on a course that would end up with him becoming a believer in Christ and one of the great apologists for Christianity that has ever lived. So I think that's just that's what I want to leave you with. It's this idea that Christmas represents the wonderful miracle of that wonderful world that we want to exist. I think even unbelievers wish this world wasn't like it was. Ask any unbeliever, ask an atheist, is there anything wrong with this world? And they'll give you a long list of things. So there's something about us that makes us want to live in another world. Well, that other world has come to us in the person of Jesus, and that's what we celebrate at Christmas. The story of Jesus truly is the greatest story ever told. He came across the universe and paid the ultimate sacrifice because he wants us to be with him. He wants us to be with him in his world, in the real world, the more real world than this one. One of my favorite preachers who's dead now is a guy named R.G. Lee. He was brilliant. He had a photographic memory, and he said once when he was in Panama, I think it was, he saw this poem, and I want to close with that. It's called A Night of Miracles. That night, when o'er the newborn babe the tender Mary leaned, a leper turned in slumber's spell and dreamed that he was clean. That night when in his mother's arms the little king was held secure, a harlot slept a peaceful sleep and dreamed that she was pure. That night when shepherds' eyes beheld the child that angels said would be, a blind man dreamed a happy dream, and in it he could see. That night when Joseph kneeled to kiss his little boy, a cripple dreamed that he could walk and woke with tears of joy. That night the newborn baby slept, the one his father gave. A dead man stirred in the sleep of death and dreamed there was no grave. Jesus is everyone's dream come true. He is the true miracle. So, Merry Christmas. Christ is come.